One of the little things that I love in The Lord of the Rings is a particular way that Tolkien sometimes describes mountains, and a lot of other things too. He spends a good bit of time describing the natural world that his characters are passing through. Too much for some readers, admittedly, but I don't want to get into that. Personal tastes are what they are, and Tolkien had an affinity for nature, and trees specifically. When it comes to mountains, Bilbo, at least, is quite fond of them. As he is preparing to leave Bag End for good at the beginning of the book, he tells Gandalf, "I want to see mountains again, Gandalf. Mountains. And then find somewhere I can rest." Of the two places he goes after he leaves, one is the Lonely Mountain, Erebor. And then he does find his place to rest, Rivendell, which is nestled in a valley surrounded by mountains. And speaking of Rivendell, as the journey of Frodo and his companions from that last homely house to destroy that ring which Bilbo left behind, we get a descriptor of various mountains. And it always tickles me. It happens more than once, but the Journey to the Crossroads chapter is as good as any to use as an example. The mountains of the Efelduath frowned at them, black and shapeless below where night lay thick and did not pass away, above with jagged tops and edges outlined hard and menacing against the fiery glow. Away to their right, a great shoulder of the mountain stood out, dark and black amid the shadows, thrusting westward. A few pages later, now in a new chapter, The Stairs of Cirith Ungol, but within that same region, we get this. They left the ring of trees and crept along the road towards the mountains. This road, too, ran straight for a while, but soon it began to bend away southwards, until it came right under the great shoulder of rock that they had seen from the distance. Are you hearing it? Let's try a couple more. This one is at the muster of Rohan. The king rode now slowly at the end of the day. Presently the path turned round a huge bare shoulder of rock and plunged into the gloom of soft-sighing trees. And this, where we learn about the fashion of the city of Minas Tirith. A strong citadel it was indeed, and not to be taken by a host of enemies, if there were any within that could hold weapons. Unless some foe could come behind and scale the lower skirts of Mindalluin, and so come upon the narrow shoulder that joined the hill of Guard to the mountain mass. But that shoulder, which rose to the height of the fifth wall, was hedged with great ramparts right up to the precipices that overhung its western end. Have you got it now? Yes, it's shoulder. Shoulder of rock. Shoulder of the mountain. And it's when I read those usages of that word that I end up doing two things. One, acknowledge the very apt description that this word gives us in terms of the position of the area that's being talked about, in relation to the mountain as a whole, which is to say, near the top, but not quite, and noticeably jutting out. The other thing I do is scratch my head and say, how in the world can people think that Balrogs have wings? Okay, perhaps that connection isn't so obvious, but let's go back to those shoulders for a moment. They are there describing the mountains. But is there anything in the text that I just read to make the reader think that, why yes, these mountains have actual shoulders, just like me? Now, I've not conducted a definitive poll on this topic, but I would have to say that the answer to that question would have to be absolutely and categorically and defiantly no, not a chance, not in a month of Sundays, or maybe even in a million years. Mountains don't have shoulders. Do us a favor. And of course, Tolkien does not stop with shoulders when it comes to describing things. A bit further on from that Stairs of Cirith Ungol text, there is a reference to the black knees of the Efelduath. At Helm's Deep, we read, there was a heel of rock thrust outward by the northern cliff. And of course, the full sentence there is, at Helm's Gate, before the mouth of the deep, there was a heel of rock thrust outward by the northern cliff. So we have mouths too. as at Minas Morgul. Here the road, gleaming faintly, passed over the stream in the midst of the valley, and went on, winding deviously towards the city's gate, a black mouth opening in the outer circle of the northward walls. So, shoulders, knees, heels, mouths. What other body parts can we find? No shape of cloud could be seen, unless it were far away westward, where the furthest groping fingers of the great gloom still crawled onwards, and a little light leaked through. So, fingers. And feet. We also get feet, like in Shelob's lair. It towered up high above them, shutting out the view of all that lay beyond. Deep shadow lay before its feet. Or on the road to Isengard, they were come to the feet of the Misty Mountains. And arms, can't forget about arms. The complete sentence of that previous bit is, they were come to the feet of the Misty Mountains, and the long arms of Nan Curinir stretched down to meet them. And speaking of complete sentences, that Ethelduath line from before actually goes, upon the further side, some way within the valley's arms, high on a rocky seat upon the black knees of the Ethelduath, stood the walls and tower of Minas Morgul. And still more arms. This bit we're still in Nan Curinir, which is the southern end of the Misty Mountains where Isengard sits. Curinir being the Sindarin name for Sauron, just as Mithrandir is Sindarin for Gandalf. Long it seemed to them that they sat and were afraid, but at last the darkness and the rumor passed and vanished between the mountain's arms. But let's get away from there and head back over to Helm's Deep. The spears of the riders were tipped with fire as the last shafts of the light kindled the steep faces of the peaks of Thrihirn. Now, very near they stood on the northernmost arm of the White Mountains, 3 jagged horns staring at the sunset. And it's not just mountains which get arms. The first sentence in the Breaking of the Fellowship chapter reads, Aragorn led them to the right arm of the river. And it's not just nature that has arms. Check out this bit as Frodo faces the Rangers of Ithilien. They sat in a wide semicircle, between the arms of which Faramir was seated on the ground, while Frodo stood before him. And just one more. This one in Mordor. Ahead, the watercourse came to an end in broken steps of rock, for out from the main range there sprang a high, barren spur, thrusting eastward like a wall. To meet it, there stretched out from the grey and misty northern range of Ered Lithui a long jutting arm, and between the ends there was a narrow gap, Carak Angren, the Eisenmouth, beyond which lay the deep dale of Udun. And that seems like a good place to stop this anatomical analysis of the natural world, and get to that Balrog, since, after all, Gandalf refers to the Balrog as Flame of Udun. Of course, it's not this Udun that he's talking about. He means the stronghold of Melkor, or Morgoth, the Dark Lord of the First Age, of whom Sauron was but a servant, and who we learn about in the Silmarillion. Autumno is the name of that place, and it's sometimes called Udun, which in Sindarin means dark pit or hell. Hell, in Tolkien's usage, by the way, is not a specific underworldy place, hell with a capital H, but simply a dark and terrible place that could be anywhere, but specifically an evil anywhere. The Silmarillion tells us, and in Autumno, he, Melkor, gathered his demons about him, those spirits who first adhered to him in the days of his splendor, and became most like him in his corruption. Their hearts were afire, but they were cloaked in darkness, and terror went before them. They had whips of fire. Balrogs they were named in Middle-earth in later days. Okay. Now, as much as I'm dying to, I don't want to go there just yet. Let's get back to the anatomy course just for a moment. The point of all those lines that I read is this. As with the shoulders, do we really think that any of those references to body parts as applied to natural phenomenon are actual body parts? No, we do not. And why? Because as readers not new to the art of reading, we recognize that these are either similes or metaphors, which are both figures of speech that use comparison to get a point across. In other words, literary devices which authors use to enhance their descriptions and emphasize the image being presented. Similes are easier to spot because they use the words like or as in the description, and there are plenty of those within The Lord of the Rings. The road to Osgiliath running almost as straight as a stretched ribbon down into the west. His face was red as a ripe apple. There they sat under an old gnarled oak that sent its roots twisting like snakes down a steep, crumbling bank. There rose another ridge, much lower, its edge notched and jagged with crags like fangs that stood out black against the red light behind them. The ends of their long sweeping boughs hung down like searching fingers. Their roots stood up from the ground like the limbs of strange monsters, and dark caverns opened beneath them. 2 for the price of 1 in that paragraph. So much for similes. As for metaphors, we have plenty of those too, a couple of which I've already read. The mountains of the Efelduath frowned at them. The spears of the riders were tipped with fire as the last shafts of the light kindled the steep faces of the peaks of Thryhirn. I mean, do the mountains of the Efelduath have faces which allow them to actually frown? And are those spears really on fire? Here's another. The passage seemed to go on for miles, and always the chill air flowed over them, rising as they went on to a bitter wind. The mountains seemed to be trying with their deadly breath to daunt them. Is the mountain really breathing? Likewise, the land was green. In the wet meads and along the grassy borders of the stream grew many willow trees. Already in this southern land they were blushing red at their fingertips, feeling the approach of spring. And here spring was already busy about them. Fronds pierced moss and mold. Larches were green-fingered. These descriptions may imply fingers, but they aren't real fingers, any more than when Faramir says to Gollum, "And do not you, Smeagol, try to dive into the falls. The rocks have such teeth there as would slay you before your time." Kind of an odd thing to say to Gollum, actually, who is well past his time, being about 600 years old right about now. But whatever. The point is, there aren't any actual teeth down there. Unless maybe in a skull left over from someone who did try to dive into the falls. So, similes, metaphors, just other ways that Tolkien or any author would use to describe something. Now, with this reality of the writer at work in mind, let's at last visit that Balrog scene in The Lord of the Rings. We are in Moria. The company is racing for the bridge of Khazad-dûm. Orcs are after them, as well as something else. What it was could not be seen. It was like a great shadow, in the middle of which was a dark form, of man shape maybe, yet greater, and a power and terror seemed to be in it, and to go before it. It came to the edge of the fire, and the light faded as if a cloud had bent over it. Then, with a rush, it leaped across the fissure. The flames roared up to greet it, and wreathed about it, and a black smoke swirled in the air. The Balrog reached the bridge. Gandalf stood in the middle of the span, leaning on the staff in his left hand, but in his other hand Glamdring gleamed, cold and white. His enemy halted again, facing him, and the shadow about it reached out like 2 vast wings. It raised the whip, and the thongs whined and cracked. Fire came from its nostrils, but Gandalf stood firm. "You cannot pass," he said. "I am a servant of the secret fire, wielder of the flame of Anor. You cannot pass. The dark fire will not avail you, flame of Udun. Go back to the shadow." "You cannot pass." The Balrog made no answer. The fire in it seemed to die, but the darkness grew. It stepped forward slowly onto the bridge, and suddenly it drew itself up to a great height, and its wings were spread from wall to wall. Now, if I had restricted my reading to just that last line, I'd say, sure, Balrogs have wings, of course. But no, I gave you 5 paragraphs, which means there is a lot more going on here. Let's take it from the first usage of the word, with an English teacher's hat on, shall we? His enemy halted again, facing him, and the shadow about it reached out like 2 vast wings. All right, class, what did we just talk about? Similes and metaphors. Yes, and so what is this? The shadow about it reached out like 2 vast wings. A simile! Very good. Now, let's read on. It stepped forward slowly onto the bridge, and suddenly it drew itself up to a great height, and its wings were spread from wall to wall. So, what is that? A metaphor? Why, yes, indeed, a metaphor. Because the only previous time that wings is mentioned, and which this use of wings could be referencing, is that prior simile, like 2 vast wings. There are no other wings that we would be talking about here. In fact, the last time in the book that wings are even mentioned is way back at the Council of Elrond, 3 chapters and 3 months ago. Of Numenor he spoke, its glory and its fall, and the return of the kings of men to Middle-earth out of the deeps of the sea, borne upon the wings of storm. And I would say that that use of wings would be a metaphor too. But back to the Balrog, and its wings were spread from wall to wall. This can only mean those wings mentioned in the simile before, which are not actually wings at all, but the shadow, which emanates from the Balrog itself. The shadow about it reached out like 2 vast wings. Because think about it, if there really were wings on this creature's back, how big would they be? The text with the metaphor tells us its wings were spread from wall to wall. Wall to wall? Well, that's pretty far, since they are in an enormous cavern, which was described as follows. Before them was another cavernous hall. It was loftier and far longer than the one in which they had slept. The one in which they had slept? Well, that one was described this way. He, Gandalf, raised his staff, and for a brief instant there was a blaze like a flash of lightning. Great shadows sprang up and fled, and for a second they saw a vast roof far above their heads, upheld by many mighty pillars of stone. And the company spent that night in the great cavernous hall. So, this one, with the bridge of Khazad-dûm in it, is another cavernous hall, which is loftier and far longer than the one in which they had slept. It therefore is a massive place. Do you really think actual wings can spread that far? And even if they could, wouldn't they weigh down the owner of them, even if it does draw itself up to a great height? The Balrog is still able to step onto this slender bridge of stone, which is so narrow that the company can only cross in single file. So it can't be that great a height that it draws itself up to, wouldn't you say? What we have here is a very simple and elegant use of both simile and metaphor being used together to describe the same thing, which is not wings, but shadow. To cement this point, let's look at something that has nothing to do with wings. It takes place in the Tower of Cirith Ungol. First, we get this text. Sam looked up towards the Orc Tower, and suddenly, from its narrow windows, lights stared out like small red eyes. simile. Later, 14 pages later to be specific, we have this. Softly, Sam began to climb. He came to the guttering torch fixed above a door on his left that faced a window slit looking out westward, one of the red eyes that he and Frodo had seen from down below by the tunnel's mouth. Metaphor. Because are these really eyes? No, they are windows, which are just being compared to eyes. Did they suddenly become eyes 14 pages after that comparison is made? Because there's no like there, one of the red eyes that he and Frodo had seen from down below, just as there is no like in the second usage of wings with regard to the Balrog. Its wings were spread from wall to wall. No, they are still windows, and just still being described as eyes. So, why would you think that just because like is not being used, that the Balrog would suddenly sprout actual wings? It's just another simile-metaphor combo. Two ways of talking about the same thing. Now, another not quite identical, but still perfectly acceptable example would be this, in the same section of the book. The tower still grinned across the valley, but the light was fading in it. This is a metaphor. The tower itself has no mouth or lips or teeth to actually grin with. It just seems like that, because it's a vivid description of the feeling the tower is giving. Cut to a few lines later. Frodo raised his head and then stood up. Despair had not left him, but the weakness had passed. He even smiled grimly. Now, this is no simile or metaphor. He has a mouth and lips and teeth, so he really can smile. No need for descriptive pyrotechnics to get that point across. It's all perfectly acceptable usages of the English language, and which, if left to be as they are, describe what they are describing extremely well. But you know what? Let's forget all about this English teacher bafflegab. You know how I really know that Balrogs do not have wings? And no, it's not the fact that in the various descriptions of Balrogs, in the Silmarillion and the Book of Lost Tales and the Fall of Gondolin, are they ever said to have wings. No. It's because of what happens in the duel between Gandalf and the Balrog. It takes place over two sequences, one in the moment and one which Gandalf tells Aragorn, Legolas, and Gimli later on. First, at that moment, Gandalf lifted his staff, and, crying aloud, he smote the bridge before him. The staff broke asunder and fell from his hand. A blinding sheet of white flame sprang up. The bridge cracked. Right at the Balrog's feet it broke, while the rest remained, poised, quivering like a tongue of rock thrust out into emptiness. With a terrible cry, the Balrog fell forward, and its shadow plunged down and vanished. But even as it fell, it swung its whip, and the thongs lashed and curled about the wizard's knees, dragging him to the brink. He staggered and fell, grasped vainly at the stone, and slid into the abyss. "Fly, you fools!" he cried, and was gone. Then, later, "Long time I fell," he said at last, slowly, as if thinking back with difficulty. "Long I fell, and he fell with me. His fire was about me. I burned. Then we plunged into the deep water, and all was dark. Cold it was as the tide of death. Almost it froze my heart." "Deep is the abyss that is spanned by Durin's bridge, and none has measured it," said Gimli. "Yet it has a bottom, beyond light and knowledge," said Gandalf. "Thither I came at last." So, what is the operative word in both of those sequences, especially with regard to wings? Fell. With a terrible cry, the Balrog fell forward, and its shadow plunged down and vanished. Long I fell, and he fell with me. Now, Picture yourself falling, especially from a great height down into a deep abyss that none has measured. If you are falling and you have wings, what would you do?
Fly, you fools!
Yes, exactly. You would fly. And before you call me out on that, when Gandalf says fly, he means run. Get out of here, fast. Not for the company to physically fly. He's using another what? Metaphor? Exactly. Well, actually, it's a synonym, but whatever. Same as in the appendices, in the Durin's Folk section, where it reads, "Thus they roused from sleep a thing of terror that, flying from Thangorodrim, had lain hidden at the foundations of the earth since the coming of the host of the West, a Balrog of Morgoth." That's about as close as you can actually get to flight when it comes to Balrogs. But since this text occurs after the revelation that Balrogs don't have wings, it's clearly not meant to be taken literally. Oh, and speaking of taking things literally, did you hear that simile that was in the bridge cracked sequence? Quivering like a tongue of rock? Do you think there's a real tongue up there? Anyways, we said we were forgetting about all that English teachery stuff. So, if something has wings, and they work, that something is going to fly. And what immediately comes to my mind here is, of course, Icarus. The myth of Icarus involves he and his father Daedalus being imprisoned by Minos, the king of Crete, because Minos thought Daedalus had helped Theseus escape from the labyrinth. Daedalus, inventor of that labyrinth, also invents a set of wings, made of a wooden frame with feathers affixed to it with beeswax. He puts one set on himself, and he gives the other to Icarus, and together they fly away. Alas, Icarus gets too excited by the freedom which flight gives him, and he flies too close to the sun, which melts the wax, causing the feathers to fall out and the wings to no longer work. And so he falls. So, wings equal flight. No wings equal falling. You know what else comes to mind? Dumbo. And no, not because I think people who think Balrogs have wings are dumb. Well, no. Dumbo falls. But guess what? He flies. And yes, I know, Dumbo doesn't have wings. But neither do Balrogs. At least, Dumbo has ears like wings, which is a what? A simile, correct. And they allow him to fly, as opposed to a shadow like two vast wings, which apparently doesn't make for the ability to fly. Meanwhile, the fight goes on with Gandalf and the Balrog. From the lowest dungeon to the highest peak it climbed, ascending in unbroken spiral in many thousand steps, until it issued at last in Durin's tower, carved in the living rock of Zirik Zigil, the pinnacle of the Silvertine. There upon Celebdil was a lonely window in the snow, and before it lay a narrow space, a dizzy eyrie above the mists of the world. The sun shone, but all below was wrapped in cloud. Out he sprang, and even as I came behind, he burst into new flame. There was none to see, or perhaps in after ages, songs would still be sung of the Battle of the Peak. Maybe the Balrog was too prideful and would not completely run away. But if you had wings, and you were not sure of winning a fight that had taken you this far, from the lowest depths of the mountain to its highest peak, wouldn't you think seriously about flying away? Or at least grabbing your opponent, flying into the air and then dropping him like a stone? You would. You most certainly would. If you had wings. And so, we end where we started. Upon a mountain. And just as mountains don't have actual shoulders, despite the various metaphorical references made to their having them, so too do Balrogs not have actual wings. And that is why those great shoulders of the mountains are one of the little things that I love in The Lord of the Rings. Thank you for listening, and have a wonderful day.